The creature took up half the pod. Issa had not known it was in there when she sealed the hatch. She had not known much of anything in those 12 seconds between the collision alarm and the auto-release sequence that blew Pod 7 clear of the Keth's morning before the fuel manifold ruptured. She had been in the corridor because she could not sleep. She had run because the alarm told her to run. She had sealed the hatch because the door seal indicator had gone red, and she had learned a long time ago that red meant close it now, not close it in a moment. She was 14 years old. She had been living aboard the Keth's morning for 3 years because her mother was the ship's xenobiologist, and because wherever her mother went, Issa went. That was the arrangement. She had thought it was a fine arrangement right up until the moment the pod's emergency lighting clicked on, and she turned around and saw what was sharing the space with her. The Vreth specimen was in a transport cage bolted to the rear bulkhead. The cage was regulation, carbon lattice reinforced, sealed with a magnetic lock, rated to hold 400 kilograms of something that did not want to be held. The Vreth weighed 360. It was curled into a shape that should not have been possible for something that large, and it was watching her with the flat, yellow-gold eyes that Issa had spent 3 months drawing in her notebooks whenever her mother brought her to the specimen bay. It was injured, she could see that much. One of the forelimbs was pulled in close against its body, held at an angle that meant damage to the joint. There was a dark stain on the cage floor that the emergency lighting turned black. Issa sat down on the opposite side of the pod because her legs had stopped working, and she watched it watch her, and neither of them moved for a long time. The Vreth were not predators exactly. That was what her mother always said. They were ambush hunters, a different thing. Predators chased. Vreth waited. They were patient in a way that made humans deeply uncomfortable because human eyes were not built to understand stillness that absolute and not read it as threat. The Vreth on the Keth's morning had been tranquilized for transport, sedated at careful intervals, kept calm by the absence of sound and sudden movement. Her mother had spent 3 months building a protocol. The protocol assumed the specimen bay, the regulation cage, and a team of 4 researchers. It did not assume an escape pod, 1 child, and a damaged magnetic lock. Issa noticed the lock on the second day. She was doing an inventory methodical, the way her mother had taught her, because when you were frightened and alone, the useful thing to do was to count what you had, and she ran her eyes over the cage assembly and saw that the impact had cracked the housing on the secondary lock mechanism. The primary lock was still engaged. The primary lock would hold. But if something stressed the cage laterally, if the pod rolled hard, if the maneuvering jets fired, the secondary would fail, and the primary would be doing all the work, and the primary was rated for a 200-kilogram specimen, not 360. She sat with this information for approximately 4 minutes. Then she went to the emergency toolkit, found the roll of cable wrap, and spent 2 hours reinforcing the cage frame at every point she could reach from the outside. The Vreth watched her the whole time. It did not move. It did not make the sound she had heard it make once through the specimen bay door, a low, resonant clicking that her mother said meant it was tracking something. It just watched. Its good forelimb was folded under its chin. Its eyes did not blink. When she finished, she stepped back and looked at it. "That'll hold better," she said, because saying things out loud helped. The Vreth made a sound she had never heard before. Soft, not the tracking click, something shorter. She went back to her inventory and tried not to think about what it meant. The pod's emergency beacon was transmitting. She had verified that on day 1, the first thing she checked after she confirmed the oxygen recycler was functional and the heating elements were on. The beacon was transmitting on the standard Coalition SOS frequency, which was correct, which should have meant that someone would come. On day 3, she began to think about why no one had come yet. The pod's navigation display, passive only, no propulsion, showed her a rough picture of where she was. Inside the outer margin of the Vreth drift, a debris field the Coalition had been trying to chart for 30 years without success because it kept moving. The Keth's morning had been transiting the drift's southern edge when the collision happened. Pod 7 had blown clear on a vector that put it deeper into the drift, not out of it. The debris field was not thick enough to stop the beacon signal, but it was thick enough to scatter it. She thought about the beacon's secondary transmitter, which was older, which her mother had once pointed out operated on a frequency that predated the Coalition's harmonized emergency spectrum. Her mother had said it in the tone she used, when something was both technically interesting and practically useless. Issa turned the secondary transmitter on anyway, on day 3, because she was 14 and practical uselessness was relative when you were in a debris field with a 360-kilogram specimen, and no way to tell anyone where you were. On day 4, the Vreth's injured forelimb got worse. She could see the swelling even through the cage lattice. The joint had been damaged in the impact, and without treatment, it was becoming something more serious. Issa's medical knowledge was limited to the first aid certification that her mother had insisted she complete before any voyage, which covered human emergencies and not much else. But she had 3 years of listening to her mother's research notes, and she knew that the Vreth were susceptible to joint sepsis if trauma went untreated, and she knew that joint sepsis in a specimen of this size and metabolic rate moved fast. She did not have Vreth medical supplies. She had a human emergency kit, 3 research journals her mother had loaded onto the pod's tablet for a different expedition, and 11 days of emergency rations. She spent 6 hours reading the journals. There was not much. Vreth medicine was a specialty. But her mother had written 3 paragraphs about the anti-inflammatory properties of a compound that the Coalition's veterinary dispensaries stocked for large specimen transit, and she had cross-referenced it against the human equivalent, and the human equivalent was in the emergency kit. The dosage was a problem. Everything was scaled wrong. Issa did the math 4 times, and each time she got a range, not a number, because she did not know the Vreth's current body weight to the precision the calculation required. She estimated. She wrote the estimate down and looked at it for a long time. Then she opened the medication port on the emergency kit, the one designed for injecting fluids into sealed compartments without opening them, and used the feeding port on the specimen cage, because the feeding port was rated for exactly this kind of remote administration, and she gave it the lowest dose in her estimated range. The Vreth flinched. Then it went still. Then slowly it lay down. It had not lain down since the accident. It had been holding itself in that curled, protective position every time she looked at it. Now it stretched out along the cage floor with its injured limb extended, and it looked at her, and it made the short, soft sound again. She wrote the time in her notebook and watched it breathe. On day 6, she ran out of things to be frightened of and started talking to it. Not because she thought it understood her, not because the Vreth were language capable in any meaningful way. Her mother had notes on that too, and the consensus was somewhere between contested and uncertain. She talked because the pod was very quiet and she was very tired, and talking helped. She talked about the Keth's morning, about the way the observation deck looked when they were transiting a nebula, all that color through the viewport, and how she used to bring her notebooks there and draw it. She talked about the research her mother was doing and how she had been learning to assist with it. She talked about a planet she had been to once, when she was 8, a garden world that smelled like rain and copper, and how she still thought about it when she needed to think about something good. The Vreth listened. Its eyes tracked her face the way they tracked moving things, precise, constant, without aggression. On the second day of talking, it began making sounds at intervals, not responses exactly, not language, but sounds timed to pauses in her speech, as if it was participating in something it did not have the architecture to fully join. On day 7, she stopped reinforcing the cage. She did not open it. She was not reckless, but the cage was holding, the medication had stabilized the swelling, and the Vreth had not made the tracking click once since day 4. She was running low on cable wrap anyway. She used the time to recheck the beacon settings and eat a meal she did not cut in half first. It felt like something that. The signal that reached the ERS Carina was not the standard Coalition SOS. The ERS Carina was an Earth Registry research ship, old, slow by patrol vessel standards, crewed by 26 scientists, and a skeleton navigation team whose primary function was archival recovery of pre-coalition, Earth-standard specimens and research data from the outer survey corridors. It was not a rescue vessel. It had a small medical bay and 2 engineers. Its captain was a woman named Solaris, 51 years old, who had spent the last 14 years of her career finding things that had been lost. What made it relevant was a passive monitoring array that had never been updated to the Coalition harmonized spectrum, because the ERS Carina needed to monitor the old Earth standard research frequencies to do its job. Those old channels were where the pre-coalition survey buoys still broadcast, where the legacy relay stations still pinged. On day 7 of Issa's drift, a secondary emergency transmitter set to a frequency that predated the Coalition's harmonized spectrum put out a fragmented SOS that no Coalition vessel would have caught. The ERS Carina caught it. Comms analyst Drea, 26, noticed it during a routine sweep. She flagged it because the signal's modulation pattern was consistent with an escape pod emergency transmitter from a late-model Coalition-registered vessel, the kind that still carried secondary transmitters on old standard frequencies as redundant backup. She ran it through 3 filters and got a rough coordinate estimate placing the source in the outer margin of the Vreth drift. She woke the captain. Captain Solaris studied the analysis for 30 seconds. Then she said, "Plot a course." The navigator looked up. "Captain, we're 11 days from the recovery site. That puts us 4 days behind schedule on the—" "I know the schedule," Solaris said. "Plot a course." They found Pod 7 on day 9. Issa had been awake for most of the last 36 hours because the maneuvering jets had fired twice, a proximity alert, the pod nudging itself away from debris, and the secondary lock on the Vreth's cage had partially disengaged on the second burn. She had spent 12 hours reinforcing it again with the last of the cable wrap and every flexible component she could strip from non-essential systems. She was down to 2 days of rations. Her notebook was full. She heard the docking clamp before she heard anything else, a sound completely different from anything the pod made on its own, heavy and external and purposeful. She sat very still. The Vreth raised its head. Then the exterior indicator on the hatch went green. She had enough presence of mind to check the atmosphere seal before she cracked it. She had enough presence of mind to stand up straight when the hatch opened, because she had decided at some point during day 6 that she was going to be upright when this happened. She thought it might have been around the same time she stopped cutting her rations in half. The woman who came through the hatch was wearing a researcher's jacket, not a military uniform. She stopped when she saw the cage. She took in the Vreth, all 360 kilograms of it, the repaired cage frame, the cable wrap reinforcements, the feeding port with its careful modifications, and then she looked at Issa. "You're the crew," she said. "I'm the crew," Issa said. "My mother is on the Keth's morning. The pod blew on auto-release. I need you to tell me the ship's status." She paused. "And the specimen needs a veterinary assessment. I've been managing the forelimb injury, but I'm outside my training." The researcher stared at her. Behind Issa, the Vreth made the soft, short sound, the one she had never been able to identify, the one it made when she finished the cable wrap reinforcement, when she administered the medication, when she turned the lights down to conserve power at the end of the day. "What's it doing?" the researcher asked. Issa glanced back. The Vreth had its good forelimb extended along the cage floor toward her, a posture she had catalogued in her notebook on day 5 as something her mother's journals did not describe. "I think it's checking on me," she said. "It's been doing that." The researcher was quiet for a moment. Then she stepped aside and spoke into her comm unit. "Captain, one survivor, juvenile, 14 years old, appears healthy and in good command of the situation. The specimen is alive and calm." A pause. "I don't have a better word for it." She looked at Issa. The Keth's morning sent a distress call after the collision. The Coalition answered. "Your mother is at way station Kareth 2. She's been sending queries into the rescue network every 6 hours since day 1. Issa sat down, not because her legs stopped working this time, because she decided to. "Okay," she said. She looked at the notebook on the pod floor, 9 days of careful observation. Everything she had learned about the soft sound and the stillness and the medication dosage and the strange patience of something that could have been terrifying but had chosen, or had found, or had simply been, something else. "Can someone photograph the cage modifications before we disassemble them? My mother will want to see how I did it." The researcher looked at her for a long moment. Then she pulled out her recorder and started documenting. Through the cage lattice, the Vreth watched them work. Its eyes were quiet. Its injured forelimb rested easy on the cage floor, the swelling almost gone, the joint held at an angle that no longer meant damage. It had been 9 days. It would be, Issa thought, something to write about.